Hey Warhammer fans, long time no fantasy talk. Well, as I attempt to get back into it, I decided it's the right time to talk about something special. I've made videos on the Empire, the Dwarfs, the Vampires, and the Greenskins, and since the Greenskins were the last faction I touched on, let's discuss a war boss that does not get enough love, despite his immense impact on the old world and even beyond, and that is Gorbad Ironclaw. Now, if you know anything about greenskin physiology, you know that they have an adrenaline-based metabolism. The more they fight, the bigger they get, and the bigger they get, the smarter they get. And while some orcs are smarter than others, meaning not every big orc is smarter than every orc that is smaller, it would be true that if the smaller orc fought and won and got bigger, it would also get smarter. And so a particularly smart orc who won enough battles could be a veritable genius. Now, that is highly unlikely, of course, because, on average, orcs are dumber than humans, even more than elves and dwarves are smarter in certain aspects. However, there are enough orcs in the Warhammer world for there to be anomalies, and one or two might even survive long enough for it to be noticed. Gorbad Ironclaw was an anomaly. We know about Grimgor Ironhide, of course, the orc version of the Ever-Chosen, essentially. He conquered and butchered his way across the old world, even before the end times. However, he really has nothing on Gorbad. Gorbad Ironclaw had less defeats, was about as big, and was twice as smart. Gorbad was the Napoleon or the Hannibal of greenskins, and is generally considered to be the smartest orc on written record. He made a mockery of all armies that came against him, not with his brawn, but with his tactics and strategy. He started out as most orcs did, in the Badlands, which are wastes with little food, little water, and a lot of monsters. We have only inklings of his earlier career, but we do know he became the head of the Ironclaw tribe. It's difficult to tell if his epitaph came from the tribe or if the tribe's name was because of him. However, Gorbad did, in fact, have an iron-clawed hand. Some art depicts it as being a slightly oversized gauntlet, but other pieces of media have him wielding a massive iron claw appendage, which is something you would normally see out of Warhammer 40k, not fantasy. In fact, it is said that at the gates of Karaz-a-Karak, the capital of the dwarfs of the World's Edge Mountains, he dented the great gates with his massive iron hand. Now, we first find Gorbad Ironclaw leading his iron claws and subjugating other tribes. Generally, the way an orc tribe subjugates another is one of three ways. All-out war is one. It's simple, straightforward, orcs love it. But it doesn't leave a lot of greenskins left over to be incorporated into the tribe. Sometimes a bigger orc with a bigger army shows up, and the other greenskin tribe realizes how much bigger the army or the orc it is, and the smaller one joins right up. Usually it's not cowardice, they just see the fact that the orc is bigger or the army is bigger as a good reason why they would be good to join. That is the second way. And thirdly, and likely most commonly, they raid one another until it culminates into two bosses fighting one another in a brutal duel. Now, Gorbad was big, even back then, and he was smart, and he knew the most cost-effective ways to grow his army. And so he likely tended to give a lot of shows of force, and when that did not work, he would kill the big boss and claim his tribe for himself. It's also said in the sourcebooks, he did his best to kill rival chieftains in as violent a way as possible. The Ironclaw's biggest rivals were the Broken Tooth tribe, a powerful tribe of orcs that stood in Gorbad's way of uniting the Badlands under his banner. The war boss of that tribe was called Crusher Zogoth, and he and his boys lived in the ruined fortress of Black Crag. Rather than assail it in a lengthy or bloody siege, Gorbad had another idea. He got some night goblins, newly added to his army, and had them dig under Black Crag, digging right into a pocket of cave squigs the night goblins knew were there. Their tunneling and their urging on sent a massive wave of cave squigs streaming into the fortress to cause chaos amongst the enemy greenskins, and Crusher Zogoth was trampled to death by the massive maud beasts. After that, the Broken Tooth orcs joined, and it was easy to maneuver the other orcish tribes, and he turned his attention to the dwarves. There's not much to say on that segment. The dwarves underestimated him, and a massive problem with dwarf armies is that their soldiers aren't nearly as expendable as greenskins, or Skaven, or even human armies. Soon, the overwhelming numbers and the strategy of Gorbad took them by surprise, and they shut their gates, though a few dwarf holds were ransacked and conquered. This was when Gorbad approached the very gates of Karaz-a-Karak and smashed his fist into the gates. Apparently, Gorbad also slew 2 giants, single-handed, in the Badlands at some point, some say at the same time. Now, as the dwarfs realized they could do little more than weather the storm, this is where the more specific accounts of Gorbad come in. See, the dwarves leave extensive records, probably the most extensive in the world, and there are immense amount of grudges in the Book of Grudges for Gorbad. However, even in a world of elves and dwarves and halflings, most records read by men are written by them as well, and in the source books, most point-of-view records are from the Empire. And when Gorbad led his Wa through Blackfire Pass, that is when we get the most extensive records because it is from the Empire of Man's point of view, and the Empire was completely unprepared for the massive orc. At this point, he was riding his prized warboar Narla. This is one of our best clues on the real size of Gorbad. You see, most of the time he's only seen riding Narla. Now, Narla was a particularly large warboar, and she is also known to have a lot of flatulence, according to the source books. But if we look at art with orc boar riders, the orcs themselves don't look large compared to their mounts, including orc biggins. However, Narla was a very large boar, yet Gorbad made Narla look kind of small, almost like a small pony. He almost looks like Radahn from Elden Ring. This means he had to be at least 9 feet tall, but likely easily larger. So, it was said a great thunderstorm heralded his approach, and when he rode Narla and his horde through Blackfire Pass, they easily swept aside the garrison and fortified keeps there, meant to hold the pass since orc was were not uncommon. However, Gorbad hit it so fast and with such numbers, they were completely overwhelmed. Before the Empire even knew what was happening, Gorbad had invaded, though we do need to acknowledge this was a strange time in the Empire's history. This was the time of the 3 Emperors, which was a period of unrest in the Empire, where there were 3 claimants to the imperial throne. Now, the Emperor that one might say was the most legitimate, because he was actually elected and lived in the traditional imperial capital, was Sigismund IV. Now, Sigismund IV was not untested in battle. There was a note that he led an imperial army into the World's Edge Mountains to aid the dwarfs against another foe, likely greenskins as well, although we don't know exactly, during the Battle of Grimgrill Dale. On that day, Sigismund received a runic horn from the dwarfs that was henceforth called the Horn of Sigismund. It's a legendary item that is still sounded to this day from the parapets of the Holy Temple of Sigmar in Altdorf each year on the anniversary of Sigismund IV's death. But back to Gorbad. He struck inside the heart of Averland, which is the province that not only guards Blackfire Pass, but it also contains the Moot, which is the small, sort of demi-province where most of the halflings live. The army of orcs and goblins were very much unused to landscape with such abundance and greenery, as well as so many settlements within easy reach. It said goblin wolf riders raided for days on end across countless miles, striking like lightning and putting towns to the torch. Averland's army was not prepared, and Gorbad's boys were also a bit too blood-drunk to be a cohesive force. So Gorbad sent his army to some ancient elf ruins on the border of the Moot, once called the 3 Towers. There he reorganized his army and instilled discipline and plots for his campaign of the Empire. This gave the frightened halflings and the army of Averland some time to prepare. The halflings themselves were not great warriors, as you might imagine. Halflings are good cooks, good thieves, good prostitutes apparently, and can beat Kobayashi in a hot dog eating contest, but they aren't really warriors. Generally, the best they have are local police forces and a contingent of archers they give to the Empire in times of war. The Averlanders, however, are good warriors. They are the army made specifically to guard the Empire from the orcs of the Badlands, and the army had also been tested in raids and the occasional battle with other imperial forces, or pretender forces. However, while the 3 days did give them time to mobilize and march, Gorbad knew they were coming. On the Aver Down, a range of low hills within the southern section of the Moot, Gorbad and his army struck the Averland forces and the halflings that called the place their home. And while we don't have specifics on the battle, the orcs and goblins picked the Imperial and Halfling forces apart. The slaughter was so great, in fact, that the only survivors of the entire Averland forces were a few members of the Knights Panther, which are a military knightly order of Imperial Knights. The Knights evidently did not retreat to Averland's capital, nor in Weissenland. They rode all the way to Altdorf to Emperor Sigismund of what they saw, telling him of not only the size of the Greenskin force, but of how the army did not move like a horde. It was formed with ranks, and maneuvered like a human force, with incredibly cunning tactics. Over the next 2 days, Gorbad's horde ransacked the Mootlands. All the halflings that had not fled were rounded up, easy pickings even for the goblins. In fact, what halflings there were that could escape tried to use the river Aver, and it was so packed with boats, rafts, and improvised floating devices that goblins had a great time using the halflings as target practice for their catapults. What halflings that were captured, that weren't just eaten, were thrown into pits to fight against snotlings for the Greenskins' entertainment. Hell, they even held halfling eating contests, and a lot of other cruel practices aside. The countryside pillaged. Many of the refugees had fled to Averheim, which was the capital of Averland, as you might imagine. Gorbad's army, after a few days of butchering the moot, hounded the refugees and followed them to the city. The defenders prepared themselves for a lengthy siege, but Gorbad had other ideas. He took his army and played a game of misdirection with the scouts and lookouts, shifting his army at night, never telling them when he might attack or even from where, until after a few short days, he ordered his catapult teams to target the towers overlooking the landscape, and then broke open the gates of Averheim. The Greenskins swarmed in and devastated the city, eating the inhabitants and butchering any warrior in their way. Now, orcs and goblins across the great forests of the Empire, the nearby mountains, even river raiders, had heard of Gorbad's successes and came to swell his ranks. During the sacking of Averheim, Brutus Leitdorf, the Elector Count of Averheim, had taken his remaining forces and fled to Weissenland, knowing that would be the next target. Now, Gorbad was a great tactician, but so was Brutus Leitdorf. He led a brilliant rearguard action and successfully destroyed the great bridge that led to the heart of Nuln. However, Gorbad had foreseen this eventuality, and had not only prepared flotillas from the river raider orcs, but also had developed a massive floating bridge of wrecked ships and smashed beams from Averheim. Gorbad's assault on Nuln was swift, and the chroniclers could knock another provincial capital city off the list. It had been a matter of perhaps 2 weeks, maybe less, and 2 imperial provinces, along with the moot, had been ransacked. No one had ever seen something so swift and methodically done. Gorbad even had a cadre of orc biggins patrolling the streets of the various cities he conquered, keeping his boys in line and bringing them back into formation to keep the cohesion of his military. So he essentially had military police. The destruction of Nuln and Averheim swept across the empire, and Leitdorf, who had survived this battle as well, fled to Altdorf. Gorbad himself had ruined any imperial armies that could come from the north, at least any time soon, and so he was free to prey upon the southern provinces of Weissenland and Saarland. Now, the 2 elector counts of these provinces, Count Eldrad of Saarland and Count Adolphus of Weissenland, got their armies together to prepare for Gorbad, finding a battlefield they felt was suitable to face the massive orc and his horde, and the 2 forces met at the Battle of Saarland's Crown. Now, this was a particularly brutal fight, as both Saarlanders and Weissenlanders knew that they were battling for their homes, families, and their very lives. Count Eldrad of Saarland himself assaulted Gorbad's position with his honor guard, attempting to cut the head off the wall and end this threat forever. But Gorbad was not just a tactician, he was a war boss, and a huge and skilled one. Eldrad showed incredible bravery, but Gorbad dueled him and cut Eldrad in half, before he took Eldrad's provincial crown and his legendary runefang, which is the runic sword every elector count has. They were each crafted by the dwarves thousands of years ago. And he put the runefang in his hoard and put the crown on his head. Now, that runefang disappears and then shows up hundreds of years later in a cave. That's a story for another time. But after the war boss placed the crown of Saarland on his head as a trophy, his army ransacked Saarland. But they weren't so gentle with it this time. This time, they killed so many people, they burned down so many buildings, that Saarland ceased to be a province entirely. After the war, Saarland was inducted into Weissenland because its population and its infrastructure was so decimated. And even in modern Warhammer fantasy, it is filled with the ghosts of the dead killed by Gorbad and his greenskins. If you've ever read Gotrek and Felix, Felix Jaeger wears a red cloak of Sudenland wool. Sudenland being another term for Old Solent, and it's considered an antiquated term and a strange item because not a lot of business and trade happens in the old lands of haunted Solent. It was at this time, after his hordes had feasted on all of Solent and much of Weissenland, that he turned back north, planning on razing the heart of the Empire to the ground. Gorbad had tried to hit the dwarfs at their heart, but the Gromril gates could not be broken. He decided instead he was going to destroy the imperial city of Altdorf to make up for it. Now, Emperor Sigismund was no fool. As Gorbad and his horde approached the city, the Emperor called for a sortie to be led out of the front gates, hoping to destroy the Wa at its heart. Out of the gates of Altdorf rode the most elite force of cavalrymen the Empire could muster, consisting of Knights of the Blazing Sun, the Emperor's own bodyguards, meaning the Reichsguard, and the Knights of the Panther, the same survivors of the doomed battle at the Aver Downs, looking to get vengeance on the Greenskins. At their head was Eric Adolphus, the Elector Count of Weissenland, who had survived the Great Battle of Solon's Crown. They rode in strict formation, making for the plumes of smoke rising from the countryside. The Imperial force met the head of the Greenskins at Grunberg, the two forces hitting one another like twin hammers. The Battle of Grunberg was unique in that it was one of the only major battles fought whose forces were entirely consisted of mounted warriors. The knights managed to drive away the goblin wolf riders, but Gorbad led a countercharge of orc boar boys flanked by goblin spider riders from the great forests of the Empire. Gorbad was confident, having destroyed every imperial force he had ever come across, and so fought without waiting for the rest of his army. His opponent, Count Adolphus, was considered one of the greatest commanders and warriors of the Empire at this time. He had counted on Gorbad moving ahead with his cavalry forces because he was famed for fighting on Narla. Adolphus ordered his knights to wheel about and concentrate on the center line to eliminate Gorbad so they might slay the orc once and for all. It said that thunder rolled across the broken ground from the heavy trot of destrayers and boars. Gorbad, with his massive axe, cut both men and horses in two, hacking apart every foe that got in his way. Even surrounded, he hacked his way out of them, but Count Adolphus, wielding his runefang, ran the huge orc through the stomach with his blade. Gorbad roared and tore the runefang out of him. The immense strength of the orc was so great he also ripped Count Adolphus's arm off, and both the commanders were bloodied. Adolphus received the worst of it though, and after his men collected the runefang from his still twitching arm, they fled back to Altdorf with their commander's barely conscious form. Now, while Gorbad was wounded, he was not out of the fight. Even a normal orc can keep fighting after being impaled half the time, and Gorbad was not a normal orc. However, it had been a runefang that had done the damage, and so while he could move, the wound bothered and pained him. It made him angry, and his usually cunning mind and cool demeanor gave way to rage. And so he launched his horde at the walls of Altdorf immediately, without any of the subterfuge or tactics of his previous assaults. He knew his army outnumbered the city's defenders, and that there was no help coming. Gorbad ordered charge after charge at the walls with crude ladders and towers, whole tribes of orcs swarming around the bogs and fens that flanked Altdorf, and countless orcs were cut down from archers and crossbowmen, while others were sucked into the bogs or trampled by their fellows. It was only after an immense loss of life did Gorbad rein himself in and realize his error, and he began setting up his siege engines. Now, it's said in some sources that the Empire was dueling the catapults with crude cannons, but this battle occurred in the year 1712 after Sigmar created the Empire, a few hundred years before the dwarfs would introduce black powder weaponry to the Empire, so there is a discrepancy in the source books. Regardless, though, Gorbad reformed his army and set it to a methodical attack, but the damage had been done already. Despite the fact he still outnumbered the defenders, the orcs had been demoralized. Now, when an orc gets demoralized, that does not mean they run for their life, or that they are in fear of their own life. That means they don't respect their boss enough to follow his orders. And some of the tribes began to forage in the countryside or leave to pillage elsewhere. Gorbad, while he still had a huge force, decided to unleash one of his secret weapons, and brought forth 6 great caged wagons. Telling his beast handlers to open them, 6 huge wyverns from the World's Edge Mountains and their riders screeched and flew into the air while Gorbad commanded his largest ground assault. With the catapults, the greenskins on the ground, and the wyverns wreaking havoc on the walls, tearing apart men and siege engines, Altdorf was being ravaged. One huge wyvern broke through the ceiling of the great palace of Altdorf, rampaging through the place, batting aside frightened servants and guards. It was said that Emperor Sigismund led a cadre of archers to kill it, but the beast survived the first volley and pounced on the emperor, and he was torn to pieces in front of his men. The wyvern continued its predations until the Reichsguard cornered and slew it in vengeance for their emperor. Gorbad had bloodied Altdorf, but he had not broken it, and after the failed assault, his army had lost its strength. Still wounded from the runic blade and without the strength to attack again, he had no choice but to withdraw. He decided to go back to the Badlands to renew his army and come back again. However, he was harassed by vengeful Imperials, particularly Solenders, and the orcs that had deserted his forces but still wanted a portion of the spoils. By the time he reached the edge of the Empire, only his Ironclaws, Broken Tooths, and a few goblin tribes remained. Still a sizable force, but they would be hit under the shadow of Blood Peak by the dwarfs, who opened their gates and who never forgot a grudge. They had been waiting for Gorbad to return, and they cut into his forces with all the fury of their vengeful ancestors. Though Gorbad cut down many dwarfs, the last anyone ever heard of the orc, he was surrounded by the grim-faced Dawi. This was 700 years before the modern-day empire, and still no one knows of the ultimate fate of Gorbad. Some say he's still alive, as no one truly knows the extent of a greenskin's lifespan, but others say that if he had lived, we would have seen him again by now. What we do know is that mothers still tuck their children in at night and tell them to behave, or Gorbad will come for them. And whenever anyone scoffs at the greenskins being naught but a nuisance, an old storyteller will correct them and tell them of how Gorbad Ironclaw and his army ruined the empire, sacked the greatest cities, and killed the best men of the age, and that if you continue to scoff, the spirit of Gorbad might find you. Okay, everyone, that's all I have to say today on the tale of Gorbad. He's one of the coolest orcs out there, with a great story. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please like, share, and subscribe if you think I deserve it, and have a great one. Alright, see you everybody.